Thanks again for joining us for our 1 Corinthians Bible study, chapter 16. If you listened to the previous recording, I did intend to deal with the first 4 verses. Didn't quite get there because we got carried away and enjoyed thinking about the comings and goings and activities of people intending or actually arriving in Corinth. Now, we're verses 1 to 4 that we're looking at today. Remember, we divided 1 Corinthians 16 up into 2 parts. Verses 1 to 4 deal with the collection for poor believers at that stage in Judea and Jerusalem. And then verses 5 to 24, final communications. Now, it's good to read scripture, so I'm going to read those first 4 verses again. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. And upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomsoever you shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. And if it be meet that I go, also they shall go with me. Now, this is a really important little section. It's a short section, and we may just get the first 2 verses done. We'll just see how we get on today. But it is really a short section about Christians using their resources to help other people, in particular to help other Christians. There's a little verse that I always enjoy reading and feel very challenged by it. If I remember rightly, it's in Galatians, and it says this: do good unto all men, but especially unto them who are of the household of faith. So the Christian should be a do-gooder. The Christian should have an interest and a burden to help people, to meet the needs of people who are in difficult circumstances. But it's not just as individual Christians that we should have that desire. We should have that desire as local churches, local assemblies. That desire should be something that every local church should be involved in on a regular basis. Now, there are a couple of passages that really stand out and speak clearly about this issue. One of them is 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. And we may cross-refer to those passages either in this recording or in the next. The other one is in Hebrews, and I'm just going to read that with you just now. Hebrews in chapter 13, and it says this in verses 15 and 16. By him, by the Lord Jesus. Therefore let us offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually. That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. Now he talks here about the sacrifice of praise to God. So that's what you say. The fruit of your lips is to be consistent, continual, and you have to give thanks to God. But then it says in verse 16, but to do good and to communicate, forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. That's a great verse, isn't it? To do good and to communicate. Now, communicate in this setting is not so much the sharing of words, but the sharing of possessions, the sharing of goods. Now, that was common in the early church. If you remember away back in the book of Acts, it says they had all things common. Now, that was because there was a need. And there was all these new believers, 3,000 saved on the day of Pentecost. And they were in Jerusalem, and they were really dependent upon their fellow believers. And so it tells us there that all that believed were together. So they're living together at this stage. They had all things common. So they shared things. They sold their possessions and their goods and parted them to all men as every man had need. So there was this common corporate responsibility that the early believers felt the need to sell things that they had and then to share them for those who were needy. So that is a very important thing. And it's a very caring thing. It's an indication that believers are in the family of God. they share in the things of God. So our verse in Hebrews chapter 13 says that we've to do good and we've to share, communicate. We've not to forget to do it because God is well pleased. But it's with such sacrifices God is well pleased. It may cost you something. It may mean that you feel the pinch in your pocket, so to speak, or the purse strings are being tightened. With such sacrifices, God is well pleased. Now, what about the local church? Well, Paul says here, now concerning the collection for the saints. So Paul had already spoken to other churches, the churches of Galatia. Not the church of Galatia, of course, you know that. There's no such thing as the church, a national church in the Bible times. That's not what God intended. There were individual churches dotted about Galatia. Paul writes to them when he writes to the churches in Galatia in the Galatian epistle. Now, he had given an instruction. He directed the churches in Galatia. And now he's going to do the same thing with the church of God, which is at Corinth. He talks about it as the collection for the saints. So they're gathering in their goods, they're gathering in possessions, they're collecting things that can be used for the welfare and the well-being and the good of fellow believers. So maybe someone would sell a piece of land. Maybe someone would have ornaments or jewellery, something that was of value that they could sell. And then they would bring the money. That's what happened in the book of Acts. And of course, you can read the salutary lesson about when there was a lack of honesty or openness about how much was being given. That's an interesting story. God leaves it to you to give what you feel is right, but he then expects you to be honest about what you're giving as opposed to try and pretend that you gave more than you actually did. But that's a story that you'll get from Acts chapter 5, and quite a serious and challenging one as well. I've noticed, I think it's 7 things that are made, 7 statements that are made in verse 2. So verses 1 and 2 are the collection, verses 3 and 4 are the people who are going to take it, and that's what we'll do with the next recording about the people who are going to take the collection. These 7 things. Number 1, it was weekly, on the first day of the week. It was regularly. So that's an important thing. So that's why you'll find many churches on a Lord's Day morning or a Lord's Day meeting, they set aside a box or a bag or a collection. I know a lot of people do it online now because of COVID and the changes that have taken place, but there should be that regular setting aside the first day of the week. That's maybe just another indication of how the believers met on the first day of the week. But the second thing is, let every one of you. So this is personal. There's an individual desire by each believer to give. So let every one of you, and I was going to read the next statement, which I will do in a moment. So it's personal. It's the fact that every one of those believers had a desire. It wasn't they were press ganged, it wasn't they were forced, it wasn't they were engineered into the circumstance. So let every one of you. Then lay by him. So that's specific. There was an action. So I think really what they were doing is they were setting it aside. So they got their money in and then they took from that and they set it aside. That was untouchable. That was going to go towards helping the believers or towards the work of God. So let them lay aside. In store. So it's really confidential, I guess, is the idea there. It's at home, really, in one sense. So this is not that everybody needs to know what you've given. It's just that you, on the first day of the week, you lay it aside, and it might have been as the church gathered, and that they did it because it's the churches that are involved in doing it, or the local church. But it's definitely individual and it's private, it's in store, it's most likely set aside at home. And I want you to notice now that it is something that is as God has prospered him. So it's set aside by him, everyone lay by him. So by him is probably the private bit of it. In store is probably the idea that it's not to be touched, separate. And then as God has prospered him. Well, really that is proportionate. God doesn't expect, if you don't have a lot of money, for you to give a lot of money. So you're setting aside. Now, in the Old Testament, they had a minimum requirement of 10%, and other percentages came into the scenario as well. And that was for national giving to a large extent, and it was to fund the priesthood and so on. But we have to give, and God loves a cheerful giver, we'll learn in the 2 Corinthians passage. And God doesn't tell us the percentage now, but we have to do it as God has laid upon our heart and in proportion to what we can afford. Then he says that there be no gatherings when I come. And that's the idea that it would be organised. You'll find cross-references to these things in 2 Corinthians, both about the idea of it being proportionate and the idea of it being private. So, for instance, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 5 says this, that they gave themselves to the Lord. So they gave themselves first before they gave their money. Just looking for the reference here, I wrote it down. And verse number 12 says, it's a willing mind. It is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. That means you can't give what you don't have. So they were to give according to God having prospered them. But it was to be organised. Paul is saying, I don't want you just, when I come, for you just to all of a sudden try and gather funds together and cajole people and get them to do what you want them to do. No, this is to be something that is organised so you're ready, so that what has been collected can be taken to support those saints when I come. Now, when we come back to this passage in the next recording, we will discover a little bit more about the organisation that took place to actually get the funds or get the goods to those who were needy. But you'll need to come back to listen to that one. Thanks for joining me on this recording today.